All right, this is Big Picture Anatomy with a look at the brain and spinal cord in a coronal or frontal section. What we're doing here is taking a slice right through the head and through the chest and abdomen and pulling the brain and spinal cord out of there and taking a look at the fundamental organization in a very cartoon-like way. And what we see at the cranial or head end is that the spinal cord swells out into the brain inside what we call the neurocranium, or the flat plate-like rounded bones of the skull that protect the brain inside. Inside. We also see coming off of the brain at the head end are going to be some nerves that go out to the vital structures of the head, sensory and motor structures, and these are called the cranial nerves, and there's actually 12 pairs of them, that is left on the left side and on the right side, so we call them pairs, and they're numbered 1 through 12 using that Roman numeral system. We'll see more about these later on. The spinal cord comes out through what's called the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull, and of course is an elongate structure that extends all the way down to the end of the abdominal cavity in the pelvis. And what we see is the spinal cord is covered over and protected by the bony structures of the vertebrae all along its length. Coming out between adjacent vertebrae are now what we call the spinal nerves. Again, they are left-right pairs. And what you can see is that the spinal nerves are organized and named in groups. There being 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic spinal nerves, 5 lumbar spinal nerves, and 5 sacral spinal nerves. Many of you might recognize that those are the same regions of the vertebral column and that they almost correspond one-to-one, of course, with those vertebral bony arches that cover over the spinal cord and protect it. The spinal nerves come off the spinal cord between adjacent vertebrae. Now, some savvy viewers might quickly recognize that when I say they almost correspond exactly, the one difference is that whereas there were only 7 cervical vertebrae, in fact there were 8 cervical spinal nerves. Why is that the case? Why are there 7 cervical vertebrae and 8 cervical spinal nerves? Well, it's just a question of bookkeeping or accounting. You can see the C1 spinal nerve comes off cranial or superior to the C1 vertebra. And that's true all the way down through the spinal nerves, C2 superior to the C2 vertebrae, C3 spinal nerve superior to the C3 vertebra, and so forth, until you get to the C7 vertebra, where you have a C7 spinal nerve coming off cranially or superiorly, and a C8 spinal nerve coming off inferiorly. From there on down, all of the subsequent spinal nerves come off inferior to their corresponding vertebrae. So here's the T1 vertebra with the T1 nerve coming off, the T2 vertebra with the T2 nerve coming off, and so on all the way down to the end of the spinal cord. In summary then, what we're looking at is a coronal or frontal view of the brain and spinal cord, taking a slice right through the mid-region of the body. We can see the brain at the cranial end, encased within the neurocranium, the plate-like bones of the skull that protect it. We can see the spinal cord, protected by the corresponding vertebrae that cover over the spinal cord. And of course, we can see the cranial nerves coming directly off the brain, and the spinal nerves coming off of each segment of the body, corresponding to those cervical, thoracic, and lumbar and sacral regions, with of course the one exception being that there's 8 cervical spinal nerves, because there's one that comes off cranial to the 7 cervical vertebrae, and that's C8 coming off inferiorly. That then is a look at the brain and spinal cord from Big Picture Anatomy.